led into the.
Well, welcome back from the break, everybody, and we're glad that you're here. Maybe I can say a couple of words, and let's ask Matthew quickly to summarize what he has just presented.
Go ahead.
One thing I would like to say is that I've served on the Animal Care and Use Committee at Cal Poly University for many, many years. So we looked at research projects involving animals all the time. And I would just say for Bioethics 101, there are the three R's of animal research ethics. The first is replace. Don't use an animal if you can replace it with a non-animal model. The second is reduce. Reduce the number of animals you have to use in your research project. And third is to refine. Make your research project as uninvasive as you possibly can, as little discomforting as you possibly can. So those are the three R's of animal research that I think are well worth considering. Matthew, what would you like to say, if anything, about your first presentation, your paper that you shared with us?
So as way of summary, since the presentation wasn't recorded, the paper basically goes ahead that I read from. I read my paper presented at the Adventist Society for Religious Studies in last year in November, which is due to be published in book form, finalized next year, I believe is the goal, through a new publication effort by ASRS. But the paper basically presents an overview of Ellen White's two different trajectories of thought: her early thinking that thought animals didn't have souls, in which she argued that the Imago Dei, the image of God, is presented primarily through intelligence and moral culpability, and that these two things were not seen in the animal world, but they are seen in humans, versus later on when she begins to think that animals have intelligence that rivals humans, and when she begins to recognize they have a level of moral culpability that is more than zero. And she begins to describe this as a mystery, and she doesn't know exactly what to make of it, but she increasingly begins to draw parallels between animals and their suffering and Jesus, as well as recognizing them on a level within the mission of God that is basically framed very similar to how she describes angels and humans. So there is this interesting thing in which her thinking progressively moves forward towards recognizing greater and greater the imprint of God in animals and what their value might be and what potential they have as souls. And the implications of this widely not discussed or dealt with issue obviously have implications for our ethical concerns about robotic ethics. If she thinks that you shouldn't abuse animals even when she didn't think they have souls, how does that apply to robots? When we eventually begin to think about their ability to recognize when their human operator is abusing them or overworking them past their operating procedures. It also has implications for what we think about in regards to the value of life. Is intelligence, as Ellen White was thinking about it, the one thing that matters most when valuing if life is important? Even though Ellen White didn't talk about mentally disabled people, her words could easily have been weaponized, or still could be, to say very terrible things about the mentally disabled and their inability to gain salvation, just as she had applied such ideas to Black people in her own time, the Black slaves that she felt had been degraded in their intelligence past salvation. So there are a lot of concerns, and the paper's purpose was to provoke the conversation we're having now.
Thank you. Over to you, Forrest.
Okay, thank you, David. We've got several hands up. Just want to remind you to please limit your question to 3 minutes. And then Matthew, because we have several hands up, so that we want to make your answers as concise as possible as well. So I'm going to go to Robert Ford first. Bob?
How you doing, Forrest?
I'm doing well.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. A question for you, that a couple of questions. what does your evolving understanding of Ellen G. White's view say about maybe God's understanding of humans when he asked the Israelites and tried to help those as they came out of Egypt to move beyond the era of child sacrifice and things that happened in those very early pre-medieval eras? And when we look at the story of Abraham, and God quotes asking him to sacrifice his son, and then he changes his mind and he says, you know, go and look in the bushes and you find an animal. So what was the whole sacrificial system, sacrifice system to do? Was it to help the Israelites to see beyond their really perverse child sacrifice and other abnormalities to a more, and maybe when they sacrificed an animal, were they supposed to see in the animal's death something that would help them to understand maybe how God understands suffering of us and how we relate to humans? That's kind of the question. The broader issue of the trajectory of and the Israelites, and then they're moving to instead of sacrificing children, they move toward animals, and then what that means. So there's that. Then to build on that, just want to mention a little bit of my background and kind of the evolution I went through. Some of you know that I worked for a while for the Dian Fossey Gorilla Fund. We knew Dian Fossey in Africa, and I've worked also with chimpanzee and famous people that have worked with, shall we say, the higher apes, gorillas, chimpanzees, and so on. And if you've spent any time at all, like I have, with these animals, you begin to realize that there's a great variety in intelligence and in how they see each other, how they relate to each other in the pack and the groups and so on. And if you've spent any time looking at animals, you begin to realize, I think, where Ellen G. White was going to. She was realizing, I think, in her later life, and maybe you can comment on that, that there was much more intelligence, much more relationship, much more love and interaction that's going on in animals than we give them credit for. And then, of course, then what does that mean? If we begin to understand that, how does that lead us toward understanding our place in the ecosystem and our responsibilities toward nature broadly, but humans as well, and animals specifically? Thank you.
So before the first question, you know, in regards to the variety of animal thinking and so forth, I think what's really intriguing is how, you know, with wild animals, you know, they'll often say, like, no matter how calm or collected the animal is, whatever relationship it has with you, it's still dangerous. Like, it doesn't stop being dangerous. But then, you know, I've learned to understand a bit more of the emotions, because, like, this dog, he looks so sweet. He looks so innocent. He seems so small. He's like really small. This is him full grown. He's a small dog. And yet, if he's frightened, in particular, he sees the brush come out, he goes ballistic. He sounds like a demon. And whereas in all other circumstances, he would never want to harm me. If I try to brush him, that triggers all his fight or flight responses. And he doesn't even think, you know, or when he's freaked out by the doorbell or something, you know, it's like his brain switches to whatever natural reflex he's got to go to right then and there. So even with, like, you think about, he's tiny, so the damage he can do when he goes into that mode, well, it's still there. It's certainly not what a tiger could do, or what a shark could do, or what anything else that has more violent capabilities. And yet when you think about it, you're like, yeah, but it doesn't change that maybe without that trigger, they're quite gentle. And there was a video I saw just yesterday that was of a guy who trains great white sharks, or like he swims with them. I forget where, if it's in Australia or somewhere else. But he, for 2 years, was swimming with these sharks in a group, and he befriended one of these sharks, named it, he'd pet it, and it was just very, very gentle and very docile and wanted to. And then the pandemic hit, had to come back, and he wondered, and then somebody goes, oh my goodness, I can see the shark. There it is, because there's a bunch of them, but this one in particular is noticeable. So he gets dressed, he gets into the scuba gear, goes under, and the great white swims up and is like, oh yes, pet me, And the words he described were so interesting. He said, these animals crave affection that they cannot, under their circumstances in the ocean, ever receive. This is an animal that wants to be petted, but can't because it's feared. And thus it reinstills their sense of hostility. And in this one instance, I have an example of one of these creatures that I can and have given affection to, and it responds very, very like a pet, like a dog. And it was just fascinating because I never thought of that with a great white shark, nor the emotional idea of an animal that is so feared that it lives basically in its own self-created bubble in the ocean. So that is, but of course, at the same time, if it got triggered, right, like my dog, it could go very badly, even if the shark doesn't want to do that. So that was interesting, just as the aspect of thinking about the animal world having all these capabilities. And then you think about Ellen White's comment where she says, of course, there are gentle animals and there are vicious animals, just like there's vicious humans and gentle human beings. Our circumstances, our environments affect all these aspects. Sin mars everything. So it's very interesting to think about the fact that there are all these various levels of intelligence, and yet there is still this commonality amongst so many of the animal world, even if their intelligence differs, of how much they can relate to those themes we find as ethical or moral, or connect us to the idea of God as love. Your first question is more difficult because you kind of, from my perspective, I have a biblical scholar hat, I have an Ellen White historical hat, I have a theological hat. And when you ask me to think about what was the purpose of the animals at the Israelite, there's several responses I can think of. There's the biblical scholar hat, which is like, okay, well, what was the environment of the Israelites sociologically? What were the other nations like? What were their beliefs at this time like? There's the theological, which is, well, really, what was God's actual desire and purpose beyond their limited understanding? And, so I want to clarify, it's difficult because on the one hand, we can look at the issue of, the sacrificial system, and I can point out several things here that will be controversial for many people listening, I assume, unless you've been in a biblical studies class on Leviticus or this. Before Jesus, the sacrificial system was not perceived messianically. There was no expectation that sacrificing lambs had anything to do with a coming Messiah. There was no expectation that sacrificing animals would have any connection to the Messiah. The idea that the Messiah would die was just almost non-existent outside of at least maybe one source we know of. For the most part, even many Jews believe there'd be two messiahs split between the priest and the royal. There, in the time of Jesus, before he came, there was not an understanding of these issues. In the Old Testament, there's no difference really in value between sacrificing a lamb and sacrificing a bird, or sacrificing your cow versus sacrificing a ram. These animals all had just various purposes that would be applied for specific needs that they understood culturally as to why this animal is more effective for this kind or that kind of an issue. So then you add to that the fact that other systems around Israel are using animal sacrifice as well as human sacrifice. So it's a common thing. It's like slavery. We don't look at the Old Testament and go, well, God said you can take slaves. Go look at Leviticus, I think it's 25. He says you can keep foreign slaves forever and never have to release them. Yeah, God endorsed it, so that must be part of his plan. A lot of people, I think the majority of people would say, no, that's just an effect of the society they lived in at that time and their assumptions about slavery being ubiquitous with just livelihood. So the question is, to what degree is their understanding of animal sacrifice the same kind of an outgrowth? Oh, we're trying to be kinder to our slaves. We're trying to get away from human sacrifice versus get rid of slavery altogether versus maybe we don't need to kill innocent animals at all to achieve God's forgiveness. You have the prophets, for example, who seem to intimate this idea when they say, God doesn't want your sacrifices. You don't have to sacrifice as long as you live a good life and you obey his commands. As much as they probably didn't mean that as literally as they said it, it's still pretty radical for anyone to say it, because it suggests that they can perceive an ethical life that exists without the necessity of sacrificial system. Perhaps that's the closest we get to the messianic connection because of how Christians connect that to Jesus. So the historical hat on my is like, well, that there's so many sociological reasons for why they go that direction. There's also the fact, too, that when we think about child sacrifice, it's not like the Bible universally condemns it. We have a lot in the Bible that condemns child sacrifice, but then in Leviticus, it says God wants child sacrifice. And he says Numbers, and he says, look, the only way I'm not going to do child sacrifice in Israel is if the Levites are substituted for it. So otherwise, I'm taking every firstborn child and you're sending him to me to die like every other nation. But if you get the Levites and they become this new entity, I consider them the substitute as a people for you guys not having to give your children. In Exodus, we have, I think it's Exodus 21 or 23, it goes ahead and says, I want every firstborn child of yours, just as I want your animals. So there is another verse later in the Torah that says the opposite. It says, but you must redeem the child, not the animal, to make sure that the child does not die. But many scholars would argue that this indicates that there were Israelites, as Jeremiah tells us, that did kill their children in the name of Yahweh and did believe it was ordered by God. In Ezekiel, we have a reference to this where it says, I gave them laws on child sacrifice intended to hurt them. And they were condemned by following it. So there is a conflict in the Bible about child sacrifice with various voices, and they move past that, where Jeremiah can say that God says, it never has come into my mind to ever want a child to be sacrificed. Never has it come into my mind. Okay, but if that's true, then how might that apply to animals? So when you ask what's the truth about it all, the theological aspect, and how might this apply to animal sacrifice, I wonder to some degree whether the issue of animal sacrifice is like child sacrifice, one of those issues that is like slavery, a movement towards a trajectory of not needing it, period, versus something that may have been intended by God, and God actually wanted the deaths of those animals or required them. Forrest, you're mute.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. Can you hear me now? Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. I'm going to go to Ed. You asked your question, and then I'm going to try to skip to the women when I find them. I know I asked Simona, so I'm going to go to you first, Ed, and then I'm going to go to Simona.
All right. Again, thank you, Matthew, for a very stimulating discussion. I appreciated it. I have for a long time operated under the assumption that Ellen White is largely a creature of her environment and her community that she grew up in. My question to you is, have you found any similarities during that time period of Ellen White's life of this, what she wrote about, with other religious leaders or other religious communities?
I have not. I got to clarify, never looked. So I can't say that, I didn't, but I didn't go to look. If I was going to make add to this and I wanted to do, or another paper to look into this, I'd probably be very curious about the connection with Kellogg. I'd probably be very curious about whether his views that were eventually rejected as too extreme, they were around this period of her changing ideas. And I would wonder if this greater argument for the connection between nature and God had any influence on pushing Ellen White to think about these issues differently. However, I will caution this, that most of the things that I find in her writings, where the letters and stuff where she's writing out these thoughts, they usually, once sorry about that. We have this automatic vacuum cleaner that starts up, and I had forgotten to disable it before. It didn't need my dog to go on a barking festival for the the perceivable rest of this. So most of the ways in which she talks about these issues is because of personal experience. She will mention that she had a superintendent who abused the animals on her farm and was known to be a horrible human being. And eventually she fires him, but she allowed him to abuse the animals for quite a while. I know that Dr. Larson asked us not to go into the topic of hypocrisy, but it is intriguing to note that this is kind of part of what I think is the direct experience that informs her views. There may have been intellectual, theoretical stuff from other people in her community that affected her as well. But part of this was honestly, I think, reflecting on her own constant affection and sympathies for animals and thinking about the humans around her in relationship to them. So I know that she grew up watching people kick to death dogs in the alleyways, I think she mentions one time. So, you know, there are things that are affecting her very practically in real life. And that may explain why, for example, her views on these issues don't really seem to develop very well. I imagine that her understanding of the Imago Dei is probably shared by a number of other voices. To what degree the shift to a new direction is affected by other people in her community, I've not looked into, but it would be very curious.
Thank you. I would like to go to Simona now. Simona?
Thank you. Thank you, Matthew. This was very interesting. I was thinking about this little story that I read long ago about how we came to have dogs and cats. And it said that when Adam and Eve were expelled from the paradise, from Eden, that they were so sad, and then angels came and they said, you know, Adam and Eve are so sad, they're depressed, they're just dragging around. Can we do something for them? And then God said, you know, I'm going to create something, a being that's going to remind them of my love, that's going to love them no matter what they do and no matter what happens. And so created a dog, which is inverse of God in English language. And then a few weeks later, angels came and said, you know, Adam and Eve are just way too proud. I mean, they're walking around, the dogs love them no matter what happens, and no matter what kind of people they are. We need to do something, teach them humility. And so God created a cat. So, you know, I was walking this morning with a friend of mine, and she has a dog, and we were talking about dogs, and she said, you know, we don't deserve dogs. And I recently wrote something in my social media. I said that may you lead such a life that you are worthy of a dog's love. Because dogs love us no matter what we do, no matter what kind of people we are. They even love those who abuse them, which is, you know, something really special. So what I'm trying to get to here is this. The greatest value of a human being is the ability to love. God is love. So if love is the supreme thing that is important in the universe, then I cannot think of another being that is more capable of that than some of the, you know, dogs and cats that we have, and probably other pets. And I can tell you one thing, you know, we talk often about, you know, eternal life and heaven and all that. I cannot imagine heaven without those I love, including the animals that I have had, have now, and will have in the future. My 2 cents.
I'm so glad you added that last part in, because that's one of the things I had to cut from the paper at ASRS. And I got to make sure I add that part back in again for the final published version. And that is that one of the arguments that that she gives about the wicked and how, and you saw that reference in the beginning of the paper. It was supposed to lead to a section later on, but it had to get cut. But basically, she had come to assume in her earlier view that the wicked were going to be granted the same kind of kindness that the animals had, which is how it led to her to think of Black slaves who had been degraded intelligence-wise to also get that kindness, which was, well, they're just going to cease to exist at that first resurrection. So what is intriguing is she begins to have that view change a bit when she starts thinking to herself, well, maybe the children of the wicked can be saved through the prayers or the intervention of the righteous around them. Maybe it's possible for there to be this weird middle category where someone who's wicked is only saved as a result of the good works or the good views or the good credit of another person who is righteous. Now, without giving credit, without like us all agreeing with her on this theory she started to play around with, it is intriguing that if she could start to think of that in regards to humans, then why would that not apply to animals? And of course, that is a trajectory of thinking that Christian ethicists have thought about, who don't imagine animals have souls. They'll argue, well, your pets are under the domain of the human who's saved, and so they'll be saved not in virtue of anything about themselves, but because they're connected to you. And of course, all these ideas are kind of similar to Paul in 1 Corinthians 7, where he's like, well, who knows, maybe you'll save your spouse by virtue of you being married to them. So these ideas have stuck around. So when you're like, I can't imagine a heaven without my dog or cat, a bunch of people have tried to argue, oh, well, actually, precisely because they're your pet, God will save them and include them in heaven. But that's still a strange theory, because it's like, well, so wait, humans and animals can have eternal life given to them, not by virtue of anything they do, just by grace alone of being attached to this particular family unit that was saved. Seems intriguing and possibly theologically problematic when you really dig into it. But it is interesting that she played around with that idea. And again, if an animal can be saved by virtue of being a part of a righteous household, shall we go further and wonder whether or not there's anything intrinsic about God just wanting to save an animal that has emotions and can love and does have all these various fruits of the Spirit within them? We look at humans all the time who are very rough around the edges, bite at other humans all the time. And we say, oh, but God sees its inner heart. He knows the truth about, well, why would that not apply to an animal too? Why couldn't God know the true heart of this animal wants to love, but it's been abused or it's been hurt or it's... So, I think it opens up lots of questions which we have not really systematically tried to explore. So I really appreciate that you brought that up at the end. Also, the humor was really funny. I've had a cat and a dog, so I can really appreciate the humor.
Anastasia, I see your hand. I'll put you on my list.
Thank you.
Okay, I want to go to David V, or is that David the Fifth?
Hi.
Hi.
Interesting discussion for sure. My thoughts are going in a little different direction. I began to wonder about the use of the word dumb and the phrase dumb animals, and wondering if we can just assume that dumb means unintelligent. That etymologically doesn't come into British English until the mid-19th century, and it may have become idiomatic here in America by the late 19th century to refer to anyone or any entity as being dumb when it meant unintelligent. But for centuries, dumb meant mute. And so I'm wondering if some of the quotations in the paper could be re-examined and viewed in light of perhaps the traditional meaning of dumb as mute. Now, it's clear the context of some, I could see that she seemed to mean unintelligent. But I'm wondering if it would change anything, maybe a view on the expression of gratitude, the extent to which animals might or might not be able to express gratitude because they can't speak, because they're mute. Now, as a tangent to that, my wife was just saying a little bit ago that she wondered about the serpent in the garden. Was it just Lucifer talking through the serpent that allowed the serpent to be able to speak? That is, Eve did not seem particularly shocked that the serpent could speak to her. And so maybe in the Garden of Eden, not only were animals more intelligent, perhaps, but more likely, some of them might have been able to speak and therefore would not have been mute in that regard, perhaps not mute in any regard, or I should say dumb in any regard. What do you think?
I think as for the second part, I think that would be there's an echo. I don't who's okay. Okay, it was you. Okay. I was like, oh my goodness, that was loud. So I think for the second part that you said, I think that would be really interesting. I should probably try looking into that for a paragraph as to when she makes her comments on Eden and on Balaam's donkey. Does her opinion or comments about the animals in those stories change based on the decade? So I'd be very curious to see if, like, does she start to talk differently about the donkey or about animals with speech in the later part when her views are changing, or does she have those views already earlier? I've never looked into that. So I really appreciate you raising that point, because that would be very intriguing to see her understanding of the implications of animal speech and how that relates to intelligence. So that's a really interesting point. So thank you for raising that. As for the first part, you're absolutely right. Somebody at the conference actually raised that point too, where they were like mentioning about how dumb might mean mute. But you also noticed that, like, for example, that one quote where she's like, look, you've got the dumb animals over here. They do not have the image of God. And over here, we've got humans with intelligence, and they do have the, and when you find out what she describes the image of God as, you start recognizing that she definitely, in that sense, she understands dumb in terms of the intelligence of the animal. But I think the answer is probably a both and. I think that probably she means it as mute as much as it carries a connotation with it as well simultaneously of intelligence. And so the question, of course, is probably more on context when she is thinking of the adjective as more this or more that. But I think it would be a mistake to try to kind of isolate each of those two meanings and say it's only this in this instance, or it's only that in that instance. It's probably carrying the weight of both of those things. And this is the unedited paper from ASRS, but I should, in the final version, which gets published, mention this as a notation, because it is true. There are going to be times where she's talking about the dumb animals, and usually those quotes I didn't like draw the most attention to the dumb aspect of the statement, because it does seem as if, to a degree, it's just talking about the fact that these are muted animals, they're background characters. But at the same time, it does seem to carry still this aspect of her undergirding ideas about what makes someone in the image of God. So, you know, it's an important point, and it does as to thinking about each quotation individually, how much emphasis did Ellen White intend in this instance for this versus that. So a very good observation. Thank you, David.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to go, this Jeff, is that really Donna? Which is it?
It's Donna.
Okay, Donna, I'm going to let you go because you had your hand up.
Hi, Matthew. Oh boy, there's so many interesting comments in addition to what Matthew's presented. I have to apologize, Matthew, because I had a hard time getting on this morning, so I didn't hear the very first part of your presentation. So I might be referring to something that you've already mentioned or dealt with. Someone made a comment earlier about Ellen White being influenced by the culture and the time in which she lived. And you may have spoken about the development of her ideas in relationship to the founding of the SPCA. I don't know. If that was okay, because to me, I'm a pediatrician by original trade. The SPCA, that is the Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, was so critical in the development of our views about children and child abuse, and sort of the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, which evolved. Really, some of the earliest activists came from the SPCA. There is a footnote in a famous US Supreme Court case that some of you have probably heard me quote before. It's Earl Warren in a case in which he described the evolving standards of decency that mark the progress of a maturing society. And it seems to me that takes place on individual as well as corporate levels, and maybe on theological levels as well. I have never been able to warm to the Christian concept of a God wanting sacrifice of any kind, whether it's animals or human beings. Don't give me sacrifice, give me a kind spirit. And so I think that as our theology should evolve, and maybe we can learn from the development of our attitude toward animals, as well as towards children and toward the vulnerable, that would ultimately change our view of the nature of God in a pretty fundamental way. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I think it makes a lot of sense. Something that's also important to know is, in the Second Temple period, there were many different Jewish groups. The people who had the Dead Sea Scrolls, the group at Qumran, as far as I'm aware, they weren't sacrificing because, their excuse for not sacrificing was that they felt the temple was defiled. And they thought it was illegitimate. So they did not go to sacrifice animals at the temple for their sins ever. They just stayed at their commune and kind of did their own religious practices without animal sacrifice, as far as I know, to try to do this. Hellenistic Jews, Greek-speaking Jews who were far away from the temple, they had to figure out by necessity, how can they function without being able to give sacrifices at major festivals? Some did create alternative temples, like at Elephantine, Egypt, where there was another temple. Most people don't realize this, that there were Jews in Egypt who went to the temple in Elephantine to sacrifice and do things there. So they tried to create an alternative secondary status temple in comparison to the Second Temple in Jerusalem to facilitate, whereas other Jews wouldn't even go to the temple. They tried to create more and more an emphasis on personal piety and prayer. And this was exactly the foundations that allowed, sort of as background for rabbinic Judaism, to begin to think theoretically about how to handle the destruction of the temple. What should they do next? Well, they could look to their Hellenistic brothers and sisters and figure out, oh, okay, so they were already doing it like this. Now we require to do it like that. So I think that it's important to know that, even in Judaism, there was already, before the Christians, a sort of practical necessity of starting to think about, well, for all these reasons, maybe we do not have to be giving sacrifices. Maybe those prophetic statements carry more weight. So I think that, it's just there's a lot of diversity in early Judaism and in the Bible and in Christianity. And sometimes we make the mistake of thinking there's a Christian view or a Jewish view, when really there was a conversation in Judaism and Christianity. And even though one side became more dominant and maybe even remained dominant, it didn't necessarily make it right. The Catholic Church was the dominant voice in Christianity for a very long time. The Reformers certainly didn't think that because it had been dominant, it was the view, merely the dominant one. History's written by the winners. The real question for theology and justice in law is the question of, well, maybe it's the dominant view, but is it actually the right one we should be thinking about?
Okay, thank you very much. I will now go to, all I have is a phone number, iPhone 845. So go ahead. 845. There we go.
That's me, Forrest.
Who is this? Is this Eduardo?
Matthew, did you consider your understanding of animals considered in Genesis 3:1? That the serpent was more crafty or intelligent than the other animals?
Can you one, because I was just kind of half focused on my dog for a second. Can you remind me your name as well as what you mean by what I considered?
That because you were talking about if the animals have intelligence, and I see on Genesis 3. I'm sorry, my name is Eduardo.
Oh, that's right. Okay, gotcha. I knew I recognized the name.
And I see in Genesis 3:1 that from the beginning, the animals have intelligence. The serpent was more intelligent than the other animals. And in regard to the having the spirit, Ecclesiastes 3:19 and 20 speaks about all have the same breath, man has no advantage over the animal, and all go to the same place. All who come from the dust and go to the dust. Who knows if the spirit of the man rises up and if the spirit of the animal goes down into the earth? Did you ever consider those texts in your presentation?
So my presentation was focused on almost entirely Ellen White's historical development of ideas, and then at the end was provoking the questions of where might our own thinking biblically, theologically go, either building on her or arguing with her. So if you're asking me where my own ideas go, that's a little bit of a step beyond where the paper was focused on. But as far as I know, but it would be worth investigating further. I don't know that Ellen White ever really draws that. Certainly in the questions where she talks about dumb beasts, dumb animals, she never draws any parallel to Genesis 3. She never invokes it. But I do think that it's intriguing to think about that. The other thing that's intriguing, of course, too, is the nature of the serpent. So, of course, in Genesis, it just says it's a serpent. I think like Nakash or whatever. But the thing is, we don't, in Christian tradition, right, like in Revelation, that comes to be understood as Satan. Now, Revelation's not the first one to think of it, but in our Bible, it's the first one to identify it. So when we think about the serpent, some scholars have, and I'm among their numbers, wondered, to what degree does this typical word for serpent possibly refer to the more developed idea of the seraph or the seraphim, the fiery serpent celestial creatures that guard the temple that Isaiah 6 sees in vision. So, if this is an angelic-like creature, there's even more interesting things to be said about this, because then that creature, that angel that's described as a serpent, the angels are being included in the animal kingdom, because he's the most, like you said, the most crafty of the animals. And so if he's an angelic figure and not just possessed by an angelic figure, then if he's a seraph in the Israelite imagination, then the angelic world and the animal world aren't so far apart. And that has implications not only for our understanding of the nature of angels, but the nature of animals and the ecosystem. So I think that's intriguing. I think also with Ecclesiastes, there's always the issue of, the writer's intention versus how we'll play with it theologically. So even though Ecclesiastes comes from a period in which the Israelites didn't believe in a resurrection. Like Job says, he goes, human beings do not have a hope for what's to come. We go down like the trees and will never rise again. The Israelites were unique before the Second Temple period in that they didn't have a belief in an afterlife, largely. And when they did talk about it, it was largely discussed as something kind of like, they have no knowledge. They're kind of just, it's some weird state of non-being, but they describe it so oddly in Sheol. But the thing is, the intention of Ecclesiastes seems to be universally agreed to be, hey, how dismal is life? The animals, they go away. We never hear about them. Just like humans, they all go down to the same grave. Why do you care? Don't be too righteous, Ecclesiastes says. Don't be too wicked. Just, find the middle path and walk and enjoy life with God. But then, if we think about this theologically, and we're Christians now, and we have that knowledge, that revelation that we do get resurrected, that through Christ we have hope, then how does Ecclesiastes change? How does Christian reading of it change? That if we do know that the humans go above, does that now mean we get to say, yay, we have an advantage over animals? Or does it mean that the message remains the same? We don't have an advantage. And if we don't have an advantage when we resurrect, then does that mean the animals likewise have been preserved to have equal status?
Matthew, can you give me another few seconds?
Just hurry up, Eduardo, 'cause we're
Yes.
getting towards the end.
Well, let me say first that I don't agree with your understanding there is no resurrection and no eternal life in the Old Testament.
I'm just describing, all I'm doing is giving what is the consensus biblical studies view in Adventism and elsewhere. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just letting you know this is how scholars of the Bible typically agree on that issue.
Okay, my last question to you is, when you see Ellen G. White evolving or developing, do you include contradiction on herself? Because I'm afraid that, because she said once, God never contradicts himself, and she speaks for God. And if you think that she did contradict herself, you imply that God contradicts himself.
Okay, all right, thank you. Thank you.
So, I can
Did you
give a
want to
quick
respond to
answer.
that, Matthew? Or?
Yes, I do. The quick answer is there is a chapter coming out in Spectrum that was inspired by a presentation I gave years ago through the Sabbath School. And that was on looking at Ellen White and the Apocrypha. And I handed out a flyer back then in the Centennial Complex that showed 3 columns: the prophecy in the book of 2nd Esdras and the Apocrypha, the writing of William Foy, who mirrors that prophecy, and the writing of Ellen White. Now, in this article coming out in Spectrum, what you'll see is in this columns, Ellen White is aware of and has, and she admits this in her later life, she had a copy of William Foy. She had a copy of 2nd Esdras. And it's very clear when she wrote out her first 2 visions, she had both of them in front of her when she was describing the visions. What's clearly important is she states definitively, William Foy was a true prophet of God. He had no error in the sense of being like illegitimate. God used him, and she always respected him throughout her life and greatly remembered listening to him tell these stories. He had the same vision as her. When you look at how she uses both writings, Foy was very liberal. Whenever he drew on 2nd Esdras, he changed it. 2nd Esdras says it's the Son of God. He writes it's an angel of God. 2nd Esdras changes a detail here. He changes it, moves it around. Ellen White does something very unique. She simultaneously claims respect for 2nd Esdras and William Foy as a prophet. But whenever Foy diverges from 2nd Esdras, she goes back to 2nd Esdras and changes Foy. Anything Foy adds that does not contradict 2nd Esdras, she keeps. So what this demonstrates, aside from the issues of the Apocrypha, is that Ellen White understands Foy as a lesser light, like she describes herself, as a prophet who's not equal to the Bible. And she treats him in the same way that she's describing how she's supposed to be treated. And so she goes ahead and essentially treats Foy as true, even when he seems to diverge from the biblical quotation mark material that he's drawing on. And I think that this is important, that we don't have a lot of good studies in Adventism on thinking about how Ellen White's own self-estimation was. We get little quotes here or there, but we very rarely study what does it mean to Ellen White about herself that she's a lesser light. She makes big statements about God doesn't contradict or etc. But here she knows that William Foy is contradicting 2nd Esdra, and she still always gives deference to 2nd Esdra, and it doesn't affect how she views Foy. Foy also believed not in the state of the dead. Foy believed that when you died, according to his vision, you would become a ghost who would become an angel in heaven immediately. Foy sees dead people that have already passed and they're in heaven guiding him. And up until the 1900s, Ellen White still says it was true visions. But she doesn't think that the dead are living. So she knows Foy saw something that didn't exist and wasn't true, but she still thinks that doesn't disqualify him as a prophet. So I think it's important to recognize that by studying William Foy and studying how Ellen White is interacting with his visions, it gives us more clarity that even if she makes these big principled statements, her view was actually far more nuanced. She understood that there was a level of error or difference or unique human vantage point that a prophet could have, and it didn't disqualify them. There was a line to be that shouldn't be crossed, but that alone wouldn't do it. So I think we have to be careful when we read Ellen White and she says these big statements, and then you look more nuanced and you see that actually in practice, that idea isn't that largely done. It's more, there's more of a very close line she follows. And we haven't done as good a job at really exploring that line, I think.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, Anastasia, I've got you. I've got a few minutes, so ask your question
Okay, thank
rapidly. I would appreciate it.
Thank you, Forrest. I do, and most of the times I do. Thank you. Okay, first of all, blessed Sabbath to everyone, and thank you so much, Dr. Korpman.
Not a doctor yet, just to clarify.
Okay, thank
Still
you.
a PhD candidate.
Mr. Korpman, Matthew, thank you so much. But thank you so much for your research. I am very, very disturbed. I was not aware of Mrs. White's statements or beliefs about the quote, less intelligent humans. I will not discuss the animals. I thank Donna and Simona for bringing up the nature of God, and I thank you for that research. Here will come my question. For someone, which I think that makes it inexcusable for her to say or to believe what she said about the less intelligent and about the Negro people or people of color, that even more the less intelligent. What makes it inexcusable is that a person, a quote prophet, who believed in the total restoration in the new earth and the new heavens, as you said, you know, of the earth. And yet, these people don't deserve or will not have eternal life or participate in this new earth. It is inexcusable. And from all the things may divide the church, that would make me run as fast as I could away, the worst distortion of the nature of God. I thank you so much.
I would love to respond, Forrest. The interesting thing, if I can play devil's advocate here, to explain why she probably thought it made sense, is think about it this way. If you start saying that if you accept the premise that your intelligence is part of the image of God, and so if it's been so degraded, what would that require of God to do? It would require him to artificially, without that person self-generating it, their restoration. Bring them back. But if God would do it with them, why wouldn't he do it with people with intelligence who are suffering with sin? So really the issue here is she's frightened, probably even subconsciously, of where the implications would be for universal salvation. Why is it that some would get this special treatment and others wouldn't. Now, of course, if we're good lawyers, we might sit there and go, well, there's definitely arguments to be had about the context and background of each person. But in general, it might make someone scared that you're opening up Pandora's box, that you're giving this ability to say, well, if it can happen here, why not there? And why not there? And I think that might explain why she and maybe others came to these weird positions where they're arguing for one thing that sounds reprehensible because they're frightened. It's like evangelicals who want to really believe that there's this eternal hell because they're kind of scared that justice falls apart if there isn't this same equal punishment for this equal benefit that everybody is getting. And so I think that might play a role in the background for why these weird views develop.
But Matthew, we are post-Old Testament. And I more than ever thank Jesus and thank God that he came to reveal and correct this terrible, terrible image of God. There is no excuse. Hitler would have a great excuse, believe in God, and he did. So the church and everyone must condemn it. I'm sorry.
I agree with it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the prophetic spirit. Forrest, you're muted. Sorry.
Yeah, I keep it muted between because sometimes the microwave goes up. I'm going to turn it over to David, but before I do, I just wanted to make a couple comments. First of all, the fourth commandment actually puts animals higher than human beings. If you realize that all those that are to rest on the Sabbath day include the animals and the beasts of burdens, but the wife is not even mentioned there at all. So that's the first thing. And then John Wesley believed that his horse was going to go to heaven. And so anyway, thank you very much. And I'm going to turn this over to David.
Thank you, Forrest, and thank you, Matthew. Matthew, we are in your death again. And we hope to hear from you still further. This issue of how we treat those who are not human beings is a very important one. And we will return to it in due course. I'm aware of 7 different Christian positions on this, and sometime we may want to overview those. But for now, thank you, Matthew. Thank you for the progress you're making in your scholarship, and thank you for your generous spirit. So here's the benediction.
Can I, before you do that, can I just say one thing that I think would be very thought-provoking, and it's something I've shared with my students, because for the last 6 months, I've had to just primarily teach law students, criminal justice students, no theology majors. And so a lot of the classes have been completely oriented towards legal issues in the realm of religion. One of the things that's really curious is when we think about animals and souls, this feels very much like a theological question, a moral philosophical question, not a legal issue. How are you going to make the legal case about this? Similarly, we hear arguments like this in regards to abortion. By the way, just to state up front, I'm pro-choice. That's my viewpoint currently. But every pro-choice person in the world thinks that there is a limit at some point. They just all disagree with it. And they want the freedom for people to have individual expectations on it. But there are people out there who would argue that precisely because it's such a mystery riddle, such a question mark, such a debatable point, that it must mean the legal system of the United States can't have anything to do with it. And of course, animal rights activists are the opposite. They're like, no, we have to create laws that are protecting these qualities. We have to create standards. And of course, pro-life people want the same thing. They're arguing that this is something that's necessary. When we reflect on robots, which is why I mentioned it, and this is important, we might think, oh, that's such a far off issue. But the thing is, it's going to have to be regulated in the same way that artificial intelligence in cars has to be regulated. For example, if anyone's taken philosophy, we all know the trolley car problem. If you're in a trolley car and you could hit 5 people, but you can turn the wheel and you'll hit only 1 person on the other track, which is the more moral thing to do? And of course, there's no right answer. But when Tesla has to submit their understanding of how an artificial intelligently driven car is going to handle that problem when it's faced with that exact scenario, the government has to clarify, the regulators have to clarify what the correct answer to the trolley car problem will be for that AI-driven car in that scenario. So what seems like a philosophical issue becomes a legal issue, becomes something that has to be regulated. We might think animals with souls is such a questionable category, but what rights do robots have will become an issue in the future, and they will be discussed, even if no one believes they have souls. Well, but they recognize that they're being abused. They're aware that the human that's currently handling them is not doing it correctly, as opposed, at what point do they have the freedom to say no if they think that it violates their terms, or if it, these things will be settled. And so the question to ask, and I would challenge, is to think through, yes, it's a theological issue, but our theological, our ethical dispositions have legal consequences. And our society has to reflect them. People were debating whether Black people had souls, not just Ellen White with her question of intelligence, but in regards to in the courts, you know, are Black people just this kind of like machinery among human beings? They're not really the same as us. And that's a great ethical question to be had by privileged people, but then there comes a point where that's not a conversation anymore. And so I would challenge people to wonder to what degree reflecting on the rights of animals and robots also has implications for questioning the value of a soul in general, and life before birth. You know, at what point should a line be drawn? Should Alito's unpublished decision in repealing Roe versus Wade, if it goes through, in the first draft, he says it's a moral issue, so the court shouldn't deal with it. Is that the right approach, though, given there's been lots of moral issues we've had? And maybe the answer is so nuanced that it won't be happy with everyone. But does that mean we should avoid the topic? I think the history of United States law and theology says we can't afford that. We should tackle these issues. And so probably by us expressing ecological concerns, we discover all kinds of ways they impact our society in other areas. And so I just hope that that makes this even more relevant for some listening.
Thank you again, Matthew. It occurred to me that maybe we should have a whole session on that one passage in Ellen White where she talks about some people being so unfortunately compromised that they are not morally responsible for themselves. And we can ask ourselves, does a child born with anencephaly count in the moral community? And I think that's a very important issue. Another one is that we speak about human beings and animals as, quote, having souls. But I wonder if we might want to talk about them being souls rather than having souls. And that if we say being souls, then that opens up a whole number of other possibilities. In any case, your presentation is inherently valuable, and it is linked to many, many other topics. So thank you very much. We will look forward to your next time with us. Here's the benediction. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.
Thank you so much for having me.